Hello there, it's Luke Kay and Vincent here, back for those of you that have not got to grips with the Standard metagame so far. We're going to quickly go through the evolution of Standard and the way the Standard metagame has shaped up since the release of Shadows over Innistrad. The first event we saw after the release of Shadows over Innistrad, it wasn't the Pro Tour, it was actually SCG Baltimore. Tell us about that, Chris. What was the deck to beat going in?
So, in a relatively unexplored field, a lot of people gravitated towards staying aggressive, and most people thought the best option there was to take advantage of the white aggressive shell that Shadows over Innistrad gifted to the format, I guess.
Yeah, that strategy seemed really strong. What won the event, Chris?
Well, it wasn't White Weenie. It was BMT Company, piloted by Jim Davis. He worked on it with a small team.
BMT Company, at least we'd sort of seen emerging towards the end of the previous Standard season. It was definitely a role player there, and it seems that the mana-based problems that we thought we might have weren't really in existence.
Yeah, losing the fetch lands didn't matter, because we've still got Evolving Wilds and we've still got all the battle lands. Yes, the mana base was admittedly... they said that was the hardest piece in the puzzle, but it turns out that, as you said, most of the shell was still there from the previous format. It was still quite powerful. It gained a couple of new tricks in Avacyn as well, so when they hold mana up, they could have Company, they could have Urgitize Command, they could have all these creatures with Flash, but now they've also got added Avacyn to the mix. And yeah, Jim Davis won the tournament, stemming the tide against the White Weenie deck.
Although it is important to note that the White Weenie decks did do well, and there were multiple copies in the top 8.
Yeah, that's right. It was well, as I said, it ended up being the most popular archetype played at the event, and there were at least 4 decks in the top 8 that you would call sort of White Weenie decks, either mono white or lightly splashing another colour for some more diverse sideboard options.
And with Baltimore being the platform of information that all the pros had when attending the Pro Tour, would you say these decks were the decks to beat going in, BMT Company and White Weenie?
Yeah, I think the pros, in terms of their metagame predictions, leaned a bit more heavily against BMT Company, because that was the more versatile of the decks. That's the deck that they anticipated their fellow community members being professional players sort of trying to use to leverage their skill. So with that in mind, the pros that didn't want to play BMT Company were thinking about, how can I develop a deck that beats BMT Company, but also make sure that it isn't weak to other decks that are geared up to beat BMT Company.
Sure. What won this event, Chris?
Well, the top 8 was quite a historic top 8.
Sure.
We had 8 different archetypes, some real big names in that top 8. So we had a red-green goggles deck, piloted by Brad Nelson, deviating slightly from the traditional ramp deck, using cards like Magmatic Insight and Tormenting Voice to draw more cards, but also discarding Drown Your Temple, which is a land that can come back from the graveyard, and you end up ramping through that, as well as the card Pyromancer's Goggles, because when you put loads of fireballs in your deck and you use Pyromancer's Goggles to cast them, apparently you get 2 fireballs.
Multi-ball.
So that's very, very good. There was also a green-black Seasons Past deck, a control deck with a heavy recursion theme that was piloted by John Finkel.
John Finkel, known pro. Johnny Magic.
Yeah, slightly known.
Some people could say.
Had the reigning world champion, Seth Manfield, playing an Esper control deck based around the new Planeswalkers. So we saw copies of Jace and Sorin in that top 8 in his hands. Also, Shouter Yasoka, Japanese pro, Hall of Fame member, battling it away with his trusty control deck, but it wasn't Planeswalkers. He stuck to the dragons.
Sure.
Dragonlord Ojutai and Silmgar's Scorn, serving him well. There was also a white-red goggles deck piloted by Louis Savata. So his deck was really interesting. It had loads of different cards. It had
Eldrazi. It's 3-color red white.
It had Beatdown, Eldrazi. It had Fireballs.
Multi-balls.
The multi-balls as well.
It was
so that was really, really interesting. And the other deck that I thought was one of the breakout decks of the tournament was LSV's green-black rights deck.
This is an interesting one.
So it used Cryptolith rights, which I think he described as basically Earthcraft, which
is powerful.
It kind of is. Putting lots of creatures on the board, quite reminiscent of the Rally the Ancestors deck without Rally.
Sure.
And basically it one-shotted a lot of opponents throughout the event by sacrificing 5 creatures to Westvale Abbey to create a 9/7 flyer. But in sacrificing those creatures, Zulaport Cutthroat triggers make short work of you, as well as the 9/7 haste with flying.
Sure, we'll see this deck evolve as the standard metagame evolves into other archetypes later on. But
you did ask what won, and that was quite a... Steve Rubin, the Platinum Pro that you don't know, apparently. Well, everyone knows him now because he's on the Pro Tour. With this green-white tokens deck. So
sure.
I don't really know what to say about this deck. I really, really like it. It's got a lot of really powerful cards, really obvious synergies. So you've got Plan A, make Nissa and Gideon use their abilities to make a load of tokens. There's Sylvan Advocate Beatdown. There's the Westvale Abbey and Secure the Waste combo. And there's also just all these synergies coming together with sort of Dramoka's Command and Avacyn is really a plan in that deck, because it played Hangerback Walker, and you can play Hangerback Walker for 0, kill a creature, set off Avacyn, or you can use Avacyn defensively. So a lot of the cards just had these aggressive and defensive modes, and he was able to stave off everyone in the top 8 and claim the Pro Tour trophy.
Claim the Pro Tour trophy really big, so that's green-white tokens there. And moving on later, a week later, there was 2 GPs, Toronto and Tokyo. Would you say green-white tokens was the deck to beat going in after Steve Rubin had done so well with it in the Pro Tour?
Well, yeah, the GP that happens roughly a week or so after the Pro Tour is the GP where everyone goes, right, let's see how good these decks that the pros played at the Pro Tour actually are. So we found in GP Toronto, there were multiple copies of green-white tokens in the top 8. John Stern, Canadian, I guess he was defending home turf in that Grand Prix, took it all the way to the finals. But it was actually Esper Dragons in the hand of Robert Lombardi that took the trophy that time. Interestingly, aside from seeing green-white tokens and Esper Dragon in the top 8, I'd just like to mention a couple of decks that didn't quite get the spotlight in as much as these two, and that was the sort of the 4-color rights decks. That was very similar to LSV's deck, but taken a step further. So how greedy can we get with this mana base? So this deck was also playing Reflector Mage, kind of mimicking the Bant Company deck, but also with a sort of more of a rights theme, because you can use Cryptolith rights to tap your creatures for any colour of mana. So you can use Lone Dryad. And it also played the combo of using Eldrazi Displacer to blink Brood Monitor. That creates
3 morbid triggers.
You get 3 Eldrazi Scion. You can sack them to activate the ability of Eldrazi Displacer to blink the Brood Monitor again. And if you have a Zulaport Cutthroat in play, I believe that's game over for your opponent.
Yes, pretty quickly.
So there was that, and also there was Grixis Control, another deck I'd like to highlight. So Oliver 2 had top 16 the Pro Tour with this deck. Basically, it was a good red and black spells plus Jace and a couple of a few counter spells in the sideboard to back it up. But it turns out this deck was quite good against that 4-color rights deck. And the whole reason that 4-color rights deck came about or got taken further is because of the green-white tokens deck that just won the Pro Tour.
So we see sort of rock, paper, scissors happening.
Kind of. We can see people starting to second-guess each other, and it's all kind of based around this green-white deck, the tone of which was set at the Pro Tour. In Tokyo, while this was all happening, there was probably a similar kind of presence in terms of those decks. But the tournament was actually won by a Naya mid-range deck.
Okay.
So it's kind of like green-white tokens, but with additional red cards in Chandra, Dragonlord Ojutai, and I think Radiant Flames was quite a key player in that, because that kept these 4-color rights deck that just spam the board with little creatures a bit more honest, maybe. And one of the other breakout decks of Tokyo, more specifically than Toronto, was this Bant Humans deck that Yuya Watanabe played to a top 16 finish. So that was kind of accelerating the Bant Company deck, sacrificing maybe a little versatility for more beatdown power in sort of creating a human synergy with Thalia's Lieutenant. Because putting multiple Thalia's Lieutenants into play off a collected company when you have any kind of human board presence is pretty devastating for the opponent. I
can imagine. So moving away from Tokyo and Toronto, we hear S-Dragons and mid-range green-white tokens still being a big part of the metagame. New York was next GP. How are we doing at New York?
So yeah, I think this was the GP that was going to decide whether this 4-colour rights deck could sort of knock green-white tokens off its pedestal, because people knew it had a good matchup against it, but could it stem the tide of the chemical mixture of everything else? So I think there were 2 copies of the rights deck made the top 8, but there was another sort of contender that reared its head, and that was this black-white control deck, which had been toyed with before, using Eldrazi Displacer, Wasteland Strangler, and Avacyn, but Seth Manfield, the world champion, went with a sort of a more creatureless shell. It was actually, in some ways, quite similar to the Esper deck that he played at the Pro Tour.
Sure.
Took out the blue and just put in more black-white base synergy.
Yeah, and removal and wraths.
Main decked Hallowed Moonlights, which I think potentially is a concession to these rights deck.
Sure.
Because they have they rely quite heavily on collected company, but also random things like if they try to go off with Eldrazi Displacer and you play Hallowed Moonlight, their creature, like their Reflector Mage or whatever they're trying to blink, isn't coming back.
Yeah.
Even just mitigating a Catacomb Sifter early on in the game, not giving them their token, can potentially slow them down enough for you to take control of the game. So Seth Manfield ended up playing against both of those copies of the 4-colour rights deck in the top 8 and destroying them because his deck was based around Languish and removal.
Yeah.
And then following up with big Planeswalkers that...
So Seth Manfield playing a deck in response to the 4-colour rights deck that basically provided a part of the metagame that pushed that one out of the metagame. Moving on to GP Minneapolis a while later, we see green-white tokens still being an important part of the metagame, still the deck to beat, still realised by a lot of the field as a good deck and a top-tier deck in the format. Yeah,
that's right. So I think now that this sort of almost like rock, scissors, papers of the green-white tokens deck, the black-white tokens deck, and this rights deck, they at least at that time, I think they really had the sort of the strongest presence in terms of contending for the metagame. So I think one of the big questions was, is this black-white control shell good against that green-white tokens deck? The reason we're trying to, the thing we're trying to beat in the first place in some respects. It turns out that actually just playing big scary threats, multiple planeswalkers, and having that lasting power potentially pushed over the edge by cards like Evolutionary Leap out of the sideboard. I actually think that the green-white tokens deck potentially has quite a good matchup against the creatureless black-white control deck in some respects, in that they just have to play these powerful threats. And the black-white tokens deck, the black-white control deck has to answer all of them. It has to actually work quite hard for its wins. I'm not saying it can't get there, but it certainly has to put a lot more effort into winning. So I think in some respects, the green-white token deck is favoured against the black-white deck, and we saw that in Alex Johnson winning with green-white tokens, and again, multiple copies of green-white tokens in the top 8.
Alongside this was GP Manchester as well, where a similar story happened. I know many viewers at home may well be have attended that GP. So Ralph Levy there winning that tournament with green-white tokens, splashing red.
Yeah, so he splashed red, but he didn't actually play
any red sources.
Not in terms of lands, no. The 4 Oath of Nisses were enough. Again, like how I mentioned earlier about the Naya deck being similar in some ways to a green-white deck, but having those red measures to keep decks like 4-colour rights a bit more honest. So I think Ralph Levy gravitated a lot more to the green-white side of it. He wanted to make sure his threats were still powerful, and in some ways there's an argument to be made for how greedy can you get. I actually played against Ralph Levy in the tournament in round 6 or 7, but I didn't even see the Chandras. It just played like a normal green-white deck, and he crushed me. So that was unfortunate in terms of like me not being let in on that tech until him top taking the event and winning. But again, I think the decks to beat going in: green-white tokens, black-white tokens, 4-colour rights. And I think one deck that I observed sort of slightly coming out of the event was this Bant Eldrazi deck.
Sure.
So it's kind of a bit like the rights deck, but it doesn't really bother with the combo or the fragility, or it has a lot less creatures that are role players in enabling that combo, and it just focuses on beatdown. So it replaces those with reality smashers and demolishes. Just a bit more business, a bit less synergy faffing about and whatnot. And then one of the more interesting decks we saw at GP Manchester was Martin Muller's Mono Blue Prison deck.
Oh,
very unique.
top 64 finish, I believe.
25th.
25th, top 32. Very impressive. Quite unique and a fan favourite, I think.
People, people have been trying that out to see, whether it is tested, whether the test of time will create greatness or not. I'm a little sceptical myself.
Sure.
Then again,
but sweet synergy nonetheless. It's important to note that around this time in the standard metagame, Wizards apologised for printing all the good cards in the colours green and white.
I haven't seen the full source, but I've heard people complaining about how all the best cards, how come all the best cards are green and white.
Yeah.
I don't think it. Well, it's the cards, but it's also the synergies that they happen to have worked really, really well together on a number of levels. As I mentioned before, when we were talking about green white at length, it can be both offensive and defensive, and all these synergies can work together to just pull you through some a range of disadvantageous situations.
And this is, of course, evidenced by the next GP on our list, which is Costa Rica, GP San Jose. Seth Manfield again, world champion.
Yeah, it's really strange. This GP was one of the smaller GPs, but a lot of professional players travelled to this GP and created quite a scary field of pro players trying to win the Grand Prix race and rack up as many pro points as he could. Yes, as you mentioned, Seth Manfield. I think I'll just switch to green white instead of black white and crush my opponents. I think he was playing like one Tragic Arrogance in the main deck,
some spicy
and one Evolutionary Elite, sort of to keep people guessing. But I think there was quite a presence or quite a resurgence. A deck we haven't talked about for about 20 minutes or 10 minutes. Bant Company made a bit of a comeback. There were multiple players in the top 8 playing Bant Company. That was the traditional sort of tempo-based Bant Company, as well as Bant Humans. So there's a bit of uncertainty as to which one might be better overall. I have a feeling that potentially the Bant Company deck itself has a good matchup against its Humans iteration because of its sort of flexibility.
Yeah.
If your opponent doesn't manage to run you over at the start, I think the Bant Company deck will always have an advantage.
Yeah, it's interesting that as Standard developed, we've got this Bant Company shell, and basically the 1, 2, and 3 drops that you play in that shell define the name of the deck. But realistically, it's that shell that's done a lot of work through the Standard metagame so far, and the pros are tinkering all the way through the metagame, basically on those sort of 15 to 20 slots of your creatures, aren't they?
Yeah. Well, as we're recording this, we're on the eve of 2 Grand Prix, 2 Grand Prix are going on in the world. We've got GP Pittsburgh and GP Taipei, and you and I took a quick look at the decks that had done well in terms of the trials and 9-0 on day one kind of thing in terms of GP Taipei. We saw a lot of green-white tokens there, so I'd continue the theme of green-white tokens kind of being the deck to beat.
Okay, so in the run-up to the event that you're at today, guys, green-white token seems to be a good decision. But yeah, that's basically the evolution of the Standard as we've seen it so far. So for those of you that haven't been keeping up with Standard, that's a quick overview. We're sure we've helped you out and helped you understand the format, so you can watch some great games of Magic here at IQ Games in Huddersfield with BMT. So please do carry on watching, and we'll look forward to you again soon. Thanks a lot.
Cheers.
Bye.